Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. We are continuing our series on the life and teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov. The first two classes, we pretty much concentrated on the life of the Ba'al Shem Tov, his birth, growing up, how he became the famous Ba'al Shem Tov towards the end of his life. And then last week, which was the third class, we began discussing the major ideas that the Ba'al Shem Tov introduced that became the foundation of the Chassidic movement. So that we started last week. Everyone can always listen to the classes. And we're going to continue this week also with just in general, basic ideas from the Ba'al Shem Tov that he taught his students, and they then spread those teachings, and that's what became the major ideas or concepts of the Chassidic movement. So we're going to continue with ones that we didn't get to last time. And remember, we're doing this in a very general way, with the idea that we will return to many of these ideas and delve into them much deeper. So we're going to start tonight with the importance of Israel in the teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov. Probably the most important thing is the Ba'al Shem himself tried to come to Israel. It's a very important and famous events in his life where he was determined to come to Israel. At that time, that was a tremendous rarity. It was very expensive, very dangerous, took months to travel from Europe and to get proper passage to Israel. Being in Israel was extremely hard in those days. But the Ba'al Shem was determined to come to Israel, not because he wanted a vacation or he wanted a tour. Is he felt very strongly that Israel was destined to play a big part in the coming of Mashiach. And already the Arizal, we discussed this last week, that so much of the teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov was that he took ideas from the Arizal and he made, in a sense, a new language to explain them that they would be understandable to people on every single level and highly relevant. And the Ari already 150 years before was saying that there is a huge change happening in the world, in history, and the beginning of the movement towards the Messianic era was already in play. Remember, the Arizal was living in Tzfat. He was born in Jerusalem. But here, the Ba'al Shem Tov is born in Europe, but as part of the importance of ushering in the Messianic era and the cardinal place that Israel has in it, the Ba'al Shem Tov tried to come to Israel. Now, for those who happen to have been at our Sunday class, we spoke about the Orach Chaim. The Orach Chaim was a great sage and teacher in Morocco at the same time as the Ba'al Shem Tov. He did come to Israel and he made it to Jerusalem. And the Ba'al Shem Tov in Ruach HaKodesh felt that if he could get together with the Or HaChaim, they could bring Mashiach together. According to Chassidic tradition, the Ba'al Shem Tov, part of his soul is the nefesh of David HaMelech. And the Or HaChaim was considered the ruach of David HaMelech. So you could see why the Ba'al Shem wanted to get together with the Or HaChaim. And apparently he got many signs from heaven not to come, that it wasn't the right time, it would not be successful. But the Ba'al Shem Tov forged ahead. He was so determined to help bring Mashiach and help put Israel back on the map as the place where all the prophecies would be fulfilled. So here, I'm speaking of this as the foundational ideas of the Chassidic movement. So right from the beginning, the Messianic thrust and the importance of Israel became part and parcel of the Chassidic movement. The Ba'al Shem Tov made it all the way to Istanbul. Many, many famous stories. Maybe we'll get to them at a different time. And then on the ship from Istanbul to Akko, the ship was pirated, was hijacked. And the Ba'al Shem and his assistant and his daughter, that's all who came with the Ba'al Shem Tov, they barely made it out of this situation alive. And the Ba'al Shem was forced to go back to Europe, and he never attempted to come again. And the Or HaChaim died a year or two later. But I'm bringing this up as one of the important things of the Chassidic movement. Afterwards, the Alter Rebbe, the initiator of the Chabad movement, who was not the generation after, but the second generation. He was a student of the Maggid of Mezrich, who took over from the Ba'al Shem Tov. And later, when he became very, very famous and influential, he was arrested on a number of charges. But one of the main charges is that he was constantly raising money to be sent to Israel to help the people there survive. And there was a Chabad presence in the Holy Land at that time, but not just Chabad. The Alter Rebbe was constantly collecting money and sending it to Israel. Now, it was a problem because Russia was at war with Turkey at that time, and Turkey ruled over Israel, the Ottoman Empire. And so the accusation, which was later shown to be false, was that he was collecting money to help Russia defeat the Ottoman Empire so that they would no longer rule in Israel. That was shown to be false. I'm mentioning it because it became a big part of the Chassidic movement to support what was going on in Israel. And at a certain point, students started to come. The most famous incident was in approximately 1770, around 10, 12 years after the Ba'al Shem Tov passed away. The Maggid took over for around 10 years, and then he passed away. And so the mantle of leadership fell upon Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. And even the Alter Rebbe accepted him as the Rebbe of the Chassidic movement. But a year later, approximately, Rabbi Menachem Mendel did a revolutionary thing as he brought 200 families on Aliyah to Israel. Now, in most Zionist history books, they will call the first Aliyah in around 1880. But this was in 1770. A few hundred families came on Aliyah with Menachem. This was like unheard of. Maybe individuals would come, and most of the time they couldn't make it here. They'd have to go back because it was so difficult to make it in Israel at that time. That's why money had to be raised. So Menachem Mendel, in a certain way, fulfilled the desire of the Ba'al Shem Tov. As I said, he became the Rebbe of the Chassidic movement after the Maggid. And that's how important Israel was in the teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov, that he came on Aliyah. The Alter Rebbe was planning on coming with him. And in fact, like I said, it was a long journey. He just didn't get on a plane and fly to Israel. You had to go from place to place until you could get proper transportation to Israel. So the Alter Rebbe was going to make Aliyah. And at a certain point, the Vitebsk Rebbe told him, you can't come with me. You need to stay in Russia and spread the teachings of Chassidut. And the Alter Rebbe really wasn't happy with this, but he accepted the mantle of leadership of Chassidus in Latvia, in the Ukraine, Russia. And so this is just a very, very strong idea. We see later that the Ba'al Shem Tov's great-grandson, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, he also tried to come to Israel, and he was successful. He was here for approximately 9 months, and then he went back. He actually arrived in Akko in the midst of a siege during the Napoleon's attempt to capture the Holy Land. So it just wasn't an easy time, but Rabbi Nachman spent 9 months. And when he went back, when people would ask him just casually, Rebbe, where are you going? He would answer, I'm always going to Israel. I'm always on the road to Israel. Okay, so that's how we're starting the evening tonight, just bringing another of the cardinal ideas in Chassidut. And it's interesting that Rabbi Nachman, when in Likutei Moharan and his other teachings, in the beginning, we weren't called Jews. We were called Hebrews, Ivrim. The first person to be called a Jew is Mordechai HaYehudi in the Megillah. Approximately 1,000 years after we left Egypt, by then the 10 tribes had been taken into exile, and only 2 remained, Benjamin and Yehuda. And Yehuda by far was the biggest of the tribes. And Jerusalem was right between Benjamin and Yehuda. And at that point, those who remained were primarily from Yehuda. And so we started, it caught on that we were now called Yehudim, Mordechai HaYehudi. But Rabbi Nachman, let me just think how many years, like 2,200 years later, it's interesting, in the early 1800s, he referred to Jews as Ish Yisraeli. He was one of the first to use Yisraeli in his writings. And he used it all the time. Ish Yisraeli. So again, this is just to show how the influence of the Ba'al Shem, that his attempt to come to Israel, even though he didn't make it, it really planted seeds that were taken up later by other people in the Chassidic movement. Now, since I mentioned already Israel, I mentioned also the idea of Mashiach. And this is something we will go into further, probably maybe even at the end of this class, next class, is based on the Aliyat Neshama, an elevation of soul that the Ba'al Shem Tov had. I believe it was 1741, when he was in the presence of the soul of Mashiach. We mentioned this last week in a different context. And he asked him, when is the master coming? And Mashiach said, when the well springs of your Torah reach the farthest limits. In other words, he was putting it back on the Ba'al Shem Tov, that the teachings that you are revealing now, that is what will bring the redemption. Now, this really actually goes all the way back to the Zohar. And it's not only the Ba'al Shem Tov's teaching. It's the idea of, one second. It's the idea of all of the mystic tradition being revealed. Not just the Ba'al Shem, that was one of the things the Ba'al Shem did, as we discussed last week, is the Arizal began to make the teachings of Kabbalah a little bit more public. But really, he only opened the door a crack. And the Ba'al Shem Tov took his foot and kicked the door open and began to reveal the secrets of the Torah. But in great measure, he did it with a new language, in a new format, in a way that everyone could understand, a very psychological type of teaching that would be relevant to each and every person. It would no longer be encoded in a very, very Kabbalistic, symbolic language that, unless you had a teacher and years of experience, you really wouldn't understand what the Kabbalah is talking about. So the Mashiach, the soul of Mashiach, reveals to the Ba'al Shem Tov the importance of his teachings. And as I mentioned, this really goes back to the Zohar, because it says in the Zohar, on the merit of learning the teachings of the Zohar, Israel will come out of exile and will be redeemed in compassion. So already in the Zohar was this idea that an intrinsic part of Mashiach coming is when the inner dimensions of the Torah are fully revealed. And of course, I want to give koach to Rav Ginsburg, who has truly dedicated his whole life to spreading the inner well springs of the Torah, the inner dimensions, in a manner that can be spread far and wide. So as I said, Mashiach and Israel play a cardinal part of not just the teachings of Chassidut, but the whole tone, the whole purpose, the whole mission of these teachings is to bring the Messianic era, and the Messianic era is intrinsically connected with the ingathering of the exiles and everything that is happening today. We are seeing these prophecies come true. And hopefully everyone will take a minute or two, actually 10 minutes to be exact, to see the living with the times that went out today. Because it's all about this idea of the meaning of the prophecies being fulfilled in our day. Okay, now we're going to continue with two other ideas that are very, very intrinsically connected, and that is the role of the tzaddik and the importance of community. These became very, very important cardinal pillars of the Chassidic movement. Always back to the Talmud, always back to the prophets, always back to Moshe Rabbeinu. There's always been the idea of having a leader of the generation, of having great Torah scholars as people we look up to, of Kabbalists and mystics that people sought out. So it wasn't a new idea from the Ba'al Shem Tov, but the Ba'al Shem Tov put a great emphasis on the role of the tzaddik, of a righteous person who had the ability to inspire and heal and push people forward spiritually. And so the idea of the tzaddik becomes a very, very important idea. And so the Ba'al Shem spoke a lot about this. And of course, he was speaking about himself, that he understood the power that he had to inspire people, to lift people up, to energize people. And he wanted that the Chassidic movement would be based around great tzaddikim and communities that would form around the tzaddik. So one of the things the Ba'al Shem taught his students is like this, that he taught his students how important it is for them to daven with the tzaddik. And therefore, it's known that even before he was revealed, in many places, he would start his own minyan, because he felt the type of prayer that was being practiced at that time was not the type of prayer that he was teaching. He was teaching a type of ecstatic, spiritual, lively, deep type of experience that prayer was supposed to be. We started speaking about this last week, and we will continue with this in the future as well. And so one of the things he taught is he understood that he was not the only tzaddik. He had around him what he called his 60 talmidim. And many of these talmidim went on to be great rebbes in their own right. The Maggid of Mezrich was instrumental in training a whole generation of inspired individuals who then went out to different communities, and each one became a Rebbe in their own right. And then what happened as the Chassidic movement spread and became more popular, so more and more tzaddikim became Rebbes, and more Hasidic communities were formed. And many of those communities still exist today, especially in Israel, and especially in, major population centers that have a lot of Jews living there. You'll have many different, they're almost called courts of tzaddikim surrounding the Rebbe. And this was really begun by the Ba'al Shem Tov. Again, it wasn't that he totally made up this idea. The idea of being attached to great souls was not the Ba'al Shem Tov's idea. It actually goes back to the Chumash itself, that one of the mitzvot in the Torah is to cling to Hashem. This is what's called devekut, to cling to Hashem. So the sages later asked, how is this possible? And then they bring another verse where it says that God is an eish ochelet, an all-consuming fire. So if God is an all-consuming fire, how do you cling to an all-consuming fire? And the answer, by clinging to Talmidei Chachamim, by clinging to, and they were talking in the age of the sages. So they were saying, so how do you cling to God? So you cling to people that you feel are truly clinging to God. And then they inspire, they awaken our own ability to cling to Hashem. So like I said, it wasn't that the Ba'al Shem made up not just this idea. When we talked about song in prayer, well, this goes all the way back to the temple. The temple was infused with music. It was one of the most cardinal experiences when you go to the temple, is to hear the music of the Levim. It was like heavenly. Everyone knows the power of music. Can you imagine being in the temple and with all of the atmosphere and longing to be close to God, and then hearing this divine music? So the Ba'al Shem Tov didn't make up this idea that song and music should be part of prayer, but he reinstituted it. It had, in a sense, fallen to the wayside. So the Ba'al Shem taught this idea of clinging to the tzaddik, and through the tzaddik, he lifts up the people around him. But he also said, not only should you pray with the tzaddik, you should also eat with him. And the last one had a tremendous effect, is that the students themselves should get together, either by themselves or with their Rebbe, and have get-togethers, which we call either hit va'adut or verbringen. In modern Hebrew, it would be called a kumtzitz. This idea of getting together informally and with music camaraderie, a couple of l'chaims here and there, opening up to each other, singing together, sometimes crying together as a community. The Ba'al Shem Tov, as I'm trying to explain, created the importance of community, of like-minded people. Now, the Jewish community always survived because of a sense of community. Here we were living in lands of sometimes of great danger, or even not great danger. We were the minority and we were oppressed. And so people always came together to protect themselves and to live together because we needed to. But this is at more of a spiritual level, that the importance of like-minded neshamas coming together and sharing together. So to this day, the idea of hitva'adut and verbringen is a huge part of the Chassidic world, a huge part. Chaim l'chaim. That's why, for example, anytime Rav Ginsburg teaches, it's always intermeshed with music and usually dancing as well. And of course, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, for 40 years, when they would have a verbringen, there was always music. And of course, Reb Shlomo, all of his teaching always was accompanied by music. But here we're talking about not a concert, not just the Rebbe teaching, but the students coming together. What's interesting is at one point, the Arizal said the following. He said, one of the reasons that Mashiach is not coming now is because we haven't perfected what he called dibuk chaverim, a coming together of friends in a real sincere manner. And he said that was in great measure preventing the Messianic movement from being pushed forward. As I said, many of these ideas we will come back to. Here, the idea is just to try to get as many of the major ideas in the Chassidic movement as envisioned by the Ba'al Shem Tov. So right now, what I'd like to do is just a review of last week's class and this class, just very, very quickly. So these are the ideas that we went through. And at this point, we're going to now move into individual teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov that had a tremendous effect on the Chassidic movement and Judaism in general. And so we discussed the whole idea of outreach. The Ba'al Shem Tov really created what we call the outreach movement. The idea that we have to reach out to every Jew, no matter what place they're holding in, no matter how much they know, how much they're on the derech, off the derech, that we need to reach out to every Jew in great love and respect. This might sound like a given, but back then, he began a whole movement with the purpose of doing this. And I mentioned last week, in great measure, This has been lost on the Chassidic movement, except really there's only two groups that still practice as part of their mission. That's Chabad and Breslov, where it's a very, very big part of what they do is they want to not only spread the teachings of Chabad or Rabbi Nachman, but they want to bring Torah to as many Jews as possible. Most of the rest of the Hasidic movement has become extremely insular. There are reasons for it, and I'm not here to judge. I'm just it's just like a fact that most Hasidic movements have become very, very insular and take care of their own. And Chabad and Breslov are more focused on spreading these teachings in the spirit of the Ba'al Shem Tov to every Jew in the world. We talked about this very important concept from the Ba'al Shem Tov based on a verse, B'chol derachecha te'ehu, in all of your ways know him. This was revolutionary that the Ba'al Shem was teaching. It's not just through Torah and prayer that we can contact God, that we can connect to God. In everything that we do, there is an opportunity to connect to God. So again, we might take this as a given, but these weren't givens before the Ba'al Shem Tov. Now we might take it as a given. Then, of course, we spoke about the idea of Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, serving God with joy. Again, this is a verse from David HaMelech 3,000 years ago. So certainly the Ba'al Shem Tov didn't create the idea of serving God with joy. But as we discussed, historically, the situation in Jewish communities was dire in those days. The oppression and really the slaughters that were happening and the pogroms, and it was horrific. And so it was almost understandable. In fact, it was practically miraculous that the Jewish people could hold on despite all of this oppression. And then the Ba'al Shem comes and says, it's time to serve God with joy. This is revolutionary. And along with that is the idea of hitchadshut, of renewing oneself constantly. In the first few generations of Chassidut, this was so important that to work, and it's spiritual work, to renew oneself every single day and not fall into rote and routine and go about doing mitzvot and davening just from rote and routine, but to infuse it with joy and kavanah and spiritual depths. And of course, we began to talk about the importance of prayer to the Ba'al Shem Tov, turning it from an obligation into an opportunity for deep spiritual experience. And we mentioned in a little bit greater detail this idea of opening up the inner dimensions of the Torah that could be experienced by everyone in a language and in a manner that would be appropriate for people to understand. So this was a major effort. And again, I have to give credit in our generation to Rav Ginsburg, who has done so much to take the inner dimensions of the Torah and to broadcast them far and wide and to integrate, especially with the arts and the sciences and all the different professions, how secular knowledge and Torah wisdom can be unified. But this really was the Ba'al Shem Tov, B'chal derachecha de'ehu. In all of your ways, know him. So Rav Ginsburg has taken, whether it's physics or biology or chemistry or law or communications or psychology or medicine or education or political science or music or art, and shown how each and every one of these has their root in the Torah itself. So in a way, this is coming directly from the revolution of the Ba'al Shem Tov. The last one I want to mention, and I'm only going to mention it here because it needs a lot of discussion, and that is the Ba'al Shem Tov's conception of divine providence, hashgacha pratit. Many of the things that the Ba'al Shem Tov taught, many people just take for granted that this is how we relate to divine providence. But it would take like a whole book to go through all of Jewish history and see different ideas and concepts about what divine providence is and how it meshes with free will. So this is the great paradox of free will and divine providence. This is, I believe the Rambam said that if all the seas were ink, remember they used to write with a quill and ink, he said it would not be enough to write about this subject of how do we understand free will and divine providence and omniscience working together. The Ba'al Shem Tov, again, I'm only going to give this over in the most general way. He proposed this idea that everything that happens is directed from above. And again, this isn't totally his idea. It says in the Gemara that a blade of grass does not grow unless an angel hits it and says, grow. Meaning that the most simple action in this world of a blade of grass growing from a half an inch to 1 inch is dependent on divine direction. But the Ba'al Shem, in a way, took it to its almost its most extreme idea that nothing happens that is outside of God's direction. So, of course, this leaves the idea of, well, where does free will come in? That's why I don't want to go into this. But the famous story that's told, and it's told in different ways. I've heard 2 different versions. Is the version that I originally heard was one time the Ba'al Shem was sitting with his students out in nature, and one of them asked, can you explain to us in a way that we could really understand what is divine providence? What does it mean that everything is directed from above? That everything is within God's providence. And they were sitting in a circle, and at a certain point, the Ba'al Shem looks up and he points, and they see that there's a leaf falling So everyone follows this leaf, and it comes down like in a spiral, and it lands in the middle of the circle. And the Ba'al Shem is watching this leaf intensely. So they're also watching the leaf intensely. They understand he's trying to teach them something. And then they see a little worm crawls up to the leaf and begins to eat it. And the Ba'al Shem Tov says that is divine providence. Meaning everything from a leaf falling to a worm eating to an atom moving, it's all being directed from above. And the other version I heard is very, very similar. The difference is that the leaf falls down, and the Ba'al Shem picks up the leaf, and there's a worm like getting ready to eat it. And the same thing. This is divine providence. Along with this, and this is how we'll end tonight, the Ba'al Shem Tov taught that the result or the consequences of this idea is that anything that a person sees or hears or experiences is a message, a divine message meant for that person. So if we just think about it, in a 24-hour period, all kinds of things happen to us. And most of it, let's say it's an uneventful day, a seemingly uneventful day. And we see this, we hear that, we think this, we think that. But the Ba'al Shem is teaching anything you see it's a message to you to learn something. And especially, this is one of the most important teachings of the Ba'al Shem in the psychological way, is anytime you see something in another person that you don't like, that bothers you, that upsets you, you should know that you're seeing this and experiencing it because you have that same thing within yourself. And that's why you are being shown this. One of the classic stories is the Ba'al Shem Tov is coming home from shul Friday night. And he's walking down the street, and in front of him, he sees two Jews are arguing. And like in not a nice way. They're like screaming at each other and accusing each other. And the Ba'al Shem Tov is first thing he thinks is, what did I do that I have to see this? What fixing do I have that I have to see this? And that's how the Ba'al Shem interpreted everything. He interpreted everything. And so this is like an extension or a application of this idea that everything that happens, it's happening for a reason, and it's happening to teach us something, and it's a message. And that nothing happens by coincidence, and nothing happens that isn't actually important. Everything has meaning to it if we could see. So these are applications of the Ba'al Shem's very all-encompassing idea of what divine providence is. Hopefully we will return to this and to many of the other ideas that we discussed tonight. Bezrat Hashem. One second.